7-year-old girl calls 911 and says, "Help, my stepfather wants to do bad things to me." Police rush over and are shocked by what they find inside the house. The autumn sunlight filtered through the bay windows of 347 Marlborough Street, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors of what real estate agents like to call a classic Boston brownstone. 7-year-old Sophie Anderson sat at the kitchen island, her legs dangling from the high stool, watching her mother Claire arrange a vase of fresh peonies, Marcus's favorite flowers. "Remember, sweetheart," Claire said, adjusting a pale pink bloom. "Dr. Sullivan is coming for dinner again tonight." She spoke with practiced casualness, but Sophie noticed how her mother's hands lingered a moment too long on each flower, betraying her nervousness. "You'll be on your best behavior, won't you?" Sophie nodded, though her stomach tightened at the mention of his name. Dr. Marcus Sullivan had been coming over for dinner twice a week for the past 3 months, ever since he'd started treating Claire for what she called her sad days. The deep depression that had followed Sophie's father's death 2 years ago. "Can I go to my room until dinner?" Sophie asked, sliding off the stool. Her new toys were still scattered across her bedroom floor from that afternoon's play session, and she knew how Dr. Sullivan felt about messiness. Last time, he'd stood in her doorway and commented on how disorder in a child's external environment often reflected inner emotional chaos. The way he'd said it made Sophie feel like she was being examined under a microscope. "Of course, honey, but first..." Claire wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and knelt before Sophie, smoothing down her daughter's unruly brown curls. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." She hesitated, and Sophie saw that familiar shadow cross her mother's face, the one that appeared whenever she was about to say something about moving on, about healing, about their new normal. Dr. Sullivan asked if he could start recording our family dinner conversations. Claire continued, her voice gentle but firm. "He thinks it might help us track our progress as a family unit. Would that be okay with you?" Sophie's chest tightened. She thought about Dr. Sullivan's intense blue eyes, how they seemed to notice everything, the way she held her fork, how many times she looked at her mother during meals, whether she finished everything on her plate. And now he wanted to record them? Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Claire smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a new therapeutic technique he's developing. He says sometimes families don't notice their own patterns of interaction, and reviewing recordings can help identify areas where we can improve our communication." She squeezed Sophie's shoulders gently. "He's really trying to help us, sweetie. You know that, right?" Sophie did know that. Everyone knew that. Dr. Marcus Sullivan was something of a local celebrity in Boston's medical community. His practice specialized in helping children cope with loss, and his waiting list was months long. Claire had called in every favor she could at her law firm to get an appointment with him. The magazine article framed in his office called him the Child Whisperer and praised his innovative approaches to family therapy. But none of that explained the cold feeling that crept up Sophie's spine whenever he looked at her with those analytical eyes, or the way his smile never seemed to match the expression in them. "Okay," Sophie said finally, because she knew it was the answer her mother wanted to hear. "Can I go clean my room now?" Claire kissed her forehead. "That's my girl. Dinner's at 6:30 sharp." In her room, Sophie mechanically picked up her toys, arranging them with precision on her shelves. She could hear her mother downstairs, humming as she prepared dinner, something sophisticated in French that Dr. Sullivan would appreciate. The sound of the kitchen timer mixed with the gentle clicking of her mother's heels on the hardwood floors, creating a rhythm that should have been comforting in its domesticity. Instead, Sophie found herself thinking about the last family dinner, when Dr. Sullivan had asked her about her dreams. Not the normal kind of dreams that adults usually ask children about, what she wanted to be when she grew up, or her hopes for the upcoming school year. No, he'd wanted to know about her nightmares. Children who've experienced loss often process their grief through their subconscious minds, he'd explained to Claire, while keeping his eyes fixed on Sophie. The content of their dreams can provide valuable insights into their psychological state. Sophie had lied then, saying she didn't remember her dreams. She couldn't tell them about the recurring nightmare where she was trapped in a glass box, screaming for help while people walked past, unable to hear her. She especially couldn't tell them that in recent versions of the dream, Dr. Sullivan stood among the passers-by, taking notes on a silver clipboard. The sound of the doorbell made her jump. Through her bedroom window, she could see Dr. Sullivan's black Tesla parked in front of their house, its sleek surface reflecting the late afternoon sun. He was early. He was always early, precisely 12 minutes before any appointed time. Sophie had started keeping track. She heard her mother's quick steps to the door, the warm greeting, the soft murmur of adult voices. Then, with deliberate heaviness that made each step sound like a countdown, footsteps on the stairs. Sophie, Dr. Sullivan's voice carried through her bedroom door, smooth as honey but somehow just as sticky. May I come in for a moment? I brought something that might interest you. Sophie looked at her perfectly arranged shelves, her neatly made bed, searching for any sign of disorder he might comment on. Finding none, she took a deep breath. Yes, Dr. Sullivan. The door opened, and there he stood tall and elegant in his charcoal gray suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, holding a small silver device in his manicured hands. His smile was as precise as everything else about him. I thought you might like to see the recording equipment we'll be using, he said, stepping into her room. It's very sophisticated. It can pick up even the quietest whispers. He held it out to her, and Sophie noticed how his fingers trembled slightly with what seemed like excitement. It's to help us be a better family, he added, his blue eyes never leaving her face. And you want to help your mother be happy again, don't you, Sophie? The way he said her name made it sound like a diagnosis. The changes came gradually, like shadows lengthening across a wall. So slow you barely notice until suddenly the room is dark. By the time Dr. Sullivan, now just Marcus, since the wedding 3 weeks ago, moved into their brownstone, Sophie had already memorized his growing list of rules. No speaking during meals unless spoken to. No running in the house. No friends over without at least 3 days advance notice. No crying where others could see. And most importantly, no discussing family matters with outsiders. Family dynamics are delicate, Marcus would explain to Claire in his office voice, the one that made everything sound reasonable and scientific. Outside influences can disrupt the healing process. It was a cloudy Tuesday afternoon when Marcus introduced what he called meditation time. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, working on her math homework, when he appeared beside her with that familiar silver notebook in his hands. I've been observing your anxiety patterns, Sophie, he said, pulling out the chair next to her. The legs scraped against the floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. Your mother tells me you've been having trouble sleeping again. Sophie kept her eyes fixed on her multiplication tables. She hadn't told her mother about the sleepless nights, about lying awake listening to Marcus's footsteps in his study above her room. The soft whir of what she now knew was recording equipment running late into the night. I've developed a new therapeutic technique, Marcus continued, making a note in his book. It's quite revolutionary, actually. The academic community is very interested in my preliminary findings. He reached out and closed her math workbook, forcing her to look at him. We're going to start with 15 minutes today. Small steps, building tolerance gradually. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. Would you like to help me with my research, Sophie? Before she could answer, he was leading her to the walk-in closet in his study. Sophie had never been allowed in here before. It was one of the many rooms Marcus had claimed as his professional space upon moving in. The closet was empty except for a small wooden chair. The mind is like a garden, Marcus explained, positioning the chair to face the back wall. Sometimes we need to create darkness for new awareness to bloom. He checked his watch. 15 minutes of silent meditation. No talking, no moving. Just focus on your breathing and the thoughts that come. The door closed with a soft click, and Sophie was plunged into complete darkness. At first, she tried to do what he said, to breathe and think calm thoughts. But the darkness seemed to press against her eyes like a heavy blanket, and the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. Marcus, she called out after what felt like hours. I don't like this. His voice came through the door, clinical and detached. Note the time of first verbal resistance. 7 minutes, 12 seconds. Continue the session. Sophie's breathing quickened. She could feel the walls of the closet pressing in, hear the scratch of Marcus's pen as he took notes on her fear. When she tried to stand, her legs shook so badly she had to grip the chair for support. Please let me out. Interesting, Marcus murmured from beyond the door. Second verbal protest at 12 minutes, 40 seconds. Elevated stress response evident in vocal patterns. When the door finally opened, Sophie blinked against the sudden light. Marcus stood silhouetted in the doorway, silver notebook in hand, watching her with that familiar look of clinical fascination. Excellent progress, he said, helping her out of the closet. His hand on her shoulder felt cold through her sweater. We'll increase to 20 minutes tomorrow. Your mother will be so proud of your participation in my research. That evening, when Claire returned from work, Marcus described the session very differently. Sophie did wonderfully with her first meditation practice. He said over dinner, cutting his salmon into precise squares. We're working on mindfulness techniques to help manage her anxiety. Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. Claire beamed at Sophie. I'm so grateful you're helping her, Marcus. I've been so worried about her fears since. Of course, Marcus interrupted smoothly. That's why documentation is so crucial. We need to track every step of her progress. He turned to Sophie, his blue eyes intense. Would you like to tell your mother about what you learned today? Sophie looked down at her plate, pushing her food around with her fork. She could feel Marcus watching her, recording her every movement in his mind for later transcription. I learned about being quiet, she finally whispered. Excellent observation. Marcus made a note in the small notebook he always kept beside his plate. Tomorrow we'll work on extending your tolerance threshold, building resilience through controlled exposure. It's quite fascinating from a research perspective. Later that night, Sophie lay in bed listening to Marcus and her mother talking in his study. Their voices drifted down through the heating vent, just barely audible. Showing classic avoidance behaviors, Marcus was saying. The darkness meditation is a proven technique for addressing childhood trauma responses. My colleagues at Harvard are particularly interested in, but are you sure it's not too intense? Her mother's voice sounded worried. She seemed very quiet at dinner. Claire, darling, you must trust the process. Every reaction, every response, it's all valuable data. Sophie is helping us understand how children process fear and loss. She's contributing to important scientific research. There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. Now, about extending your hours at the firm. Sophie pulled her blanket over her head, trying to block out the voices. In the darkness under her covers, she could almost imagine she was back in the closet. She wondered if Marcus was recording this too, her heart rate, her breathing, the way her hands shook as she gripped her stuffed rabbit. Tomorrow would be 20 minutes in the dark. The day after, maybe longer. Sophie closed her eyes and tried to practice being quiet, being still, being the perfect subject for Marcus's research. Above her, the soft whir of recording equipment continued long into the night. Sophie hadn't had a friend over since Marcus moved in, which made Katie's sleepover invitation even more surprising. She sat at the breakfast table, hardly daring to breathe as Marcus reviewed the handwritten note from Katie's mother. An interesting proposition, he said finally, placing the note beside his morning coffee. Perhaps it's time to document peer interaction patterns. He made a quick note in his ever-present notebook before looking at Claire. What are your thoughts, dear? Claire glanced up from her laptop, where she was already responding to early morning emails from her law firm. Oh, I think it would be wonderful for Sophie to have Katie over. They've been friends since kindergarten, and we haven't had her visit in so long. This Friday, then, Marcus decided, his pen scratching against paper. I'll be working from home, purely to observe, of course. The dynamics of childhood friendship in the context of family restructuring is particularly relevant to my current research. That Friday evening, Katie arrived wearing pink pajamas with unicorns, carrying a sparkly sleeping bag and chattering excitedly about their planned activities. Sophie felt a flutter of genuine happiness for the first time in weeks. Mom bought us cookie dough to bake, Katie announced, hugging Sophie. and I brought Frozen to watch and... Good evening, Katie. Marcus's voice cut through the girl's excitement like a knife through ice. He stood in the doorway to his study, notebook in hand. I've prepared a special herbal tea for you both. It's part of our family's evening ritual, something I've developed to help with relaxation and social bonding. Sophie's stomach clenched. She recognized the distinctive blue ceramic teapot he used for what he called his therapeutic blends. In his study, Marcus poured the pale golden liquid into delicate white cups. This particular blend, he explained, watching the girls intently, contains chamomile, lavender, and several other carefully selected herbs. I've been documenting its effects on stress reduction in children. Katie took her cup eagerly, always ready to play grown-up. Sophie watched in horror as her friend sipped the tea, knowing what was coming but unable to warn her. It tastes funny, Katie said after a few moments, her face scrunching up. Interesting, Marcus murmured, pen moving rapidly across paper. Initial taste response. Negative. Please continue, Katie. The full therapeutic benefits require complete consumption. Within an hour, Katie was violently ill. Sophie held her friend's hair back in the bathroom, listening to Marcus calmly explaining to Katie's panicked mother over the phone that it must have been something the girls ate earlier. Food poisoning can onset quite suddenly in children, he said, his voice carrying that professional authority that adults never questioned. Yes, of course I understand. I'll have her ready for pickup in 20 minutes. After Katie left, Marcus spent hours in his study, transcribing notes. Sophie lay awake in her bed, remembering how he'd watched Katie's deterioration with those cold, calculating eyes, occasionally murmuring into his digital recorder. Subject shows increased pallor, gastrointestinal distress onset at approximately 47 minutes post-consumption. Notable anxiety response in control subject, Sophie. The next morning, Claire read the email from Katie's mother over breakfast. They don't think it's best for Katie to sleep over anymore, she said, sounding disappointed. Apparently she was sick all weekend. Such a shame. Children's immune systems can be quite unpredictable, Marcus commented, stirring his coffee. Sophie, would you like some tea? I've adjusted the blend slightly. For research purposes, of course. Sophie stared at the blue teapot, her hands trembling under the table. I'm not thirsty. Note the time, Marcus spoke softly into his recorder. Subject displays clear aversion response to offered stimulus. Beginning phase 2 of social isolation study. That night, Sophie crept down to the kitchen and found the blue teapot in the dishwasher. As she reached for it, wanting to understand what had happened to Katie, she heard Marcus's voice behind her. Curious about my research methods, Sophie? She spun around. He stood in the doorway, silver notebook glinting in the darkness. I find children's responses to perceived threats fascinating, he continued, moving into the kitchen. The way fear shapes behavior creates new neural pathways. He opened his notebook. Would you like to help me document this midnight encounter? For science. Sophie ran back to her room, Marcus's soft laughter following her up the stairs. In the darkness, she could hear him speaking into his recorder. Subject demonstrates heightened fight or flight response. Recommend increasing stimulus intensity in next phase of study. Note potential correlation between parental absence and subject compliance. The next morning, the blue teapot sat prominently on the breakfast table, steam rising from its spout like a warning. February brought early sunsets and long shadows to their Boston brownstone. Sophie had grown accustomed to the silence that now ruled their home, but not to the mirrors. They appeared gradually, first a full-length one in the hallway, then smaller ones in seemingly random places. Above her desk, beside her bed, in corners of rooms where their reflective surfaces caught unexpected movements. Environmental modification continues, Marcus dictated into his recorder one evening, adjusting a newly installed mirror in Sophie's bedroom. Subject exhibits increasing awareness of self-monitoring behaviors. Sophie sat on her bed, watching him work through the reflection of another mirror. Everything in her room now had at least 2 angles of view, creating infinite reflections that made her feel like she was being watched from every direction. Do you know why mirrors are so important in psychological development, Sophie? Marcus asked, turning to face her with that familiar clinical smile. They help us understand how others see us. Today, we're going to try something new in my office. A special therapy session. The word therapy had come to fill Sophie with dread. She followed Marcus down the hall to his office, where he'd transformed the space since morning. Mirrors of varying sizes covered every wall, positioned at slightly different angles. In the center stood a single wooden chair. Sit, Marcus instructed, closing the door. Today's session will focus on self-perception and identity dissolution. Quite groundbreaking research, actually. Sophie sat, immediately surrounded by countless reflections of herself. Each mirror showed a slightly different angle, creating a kaleidoscope of Sophies, all looking equally trapped. We'll start with 30 minutes, Marcus said, positioning his camera in the corner. I want you to look at each reflection and tell me what you see. Don't look away. Remember, this is all for science. The minutes crawled by. Sophie watched her reflections begin to waver and distort as her eyes grew tired. Sometimes, in the corner of one mirror, she thought she caught glimpses of Marcus moving behind her, taking notes, adjusting equipment. Fascinating, he murmured, speaking into his recorder. Subject showing early signs of dissociative response. Note the time. 17 minutes into session, Sophie tried to focus on one reflection, but they all seemed wrong somehow, like strangers wearing her face. Her head began to spin. I don't feel good, she whispered. Continue observing, Marcus instructed. Tell me, Sophie, which reflection is the real you? How do you know? Tears began rolling down her cheeks, multiplied infinitely in the mirrors. Each reflection seemed to cry differently, some silently, others with obvious distress. Sophie couldn't remember which one matched her own face. Please, note increased emotional distress at 24 minutes, Marcus dictated. Subject displaying classic symptoms of mirror-induced depersonalization. Exceptional research material. When Claire came home that night, Marcus described the session very differently. We made wonderful progress today with self-awareness exercises. He explained over dinner. Sophie is helping me pioneer new therapeutic techniques for children processing grief. That's wonderful. Claire beamed, squeezing Sophie's hand. I'm so proud of you for helping with Marcus's research, sweetheart. Sophie stared at her plate, avoiding the decorative mirrors Marcus had installed in the dining room. She could feel him watching her, both directly and through the reflections, always observing, always taking notes. That night, she covered her bedroom mirror with a blanket. When she woke the next morning, the blanket was gone, and a new, larger mirror had been installed directly opposite her bed. Environmental response modification continues. She heard Marcus dictating in the hallway. Subject demonstrates increasing attempts at avoidance. Recommend intensifying exposure protocol. Sophie closed her eyes, but she could still feel the weight of all those reflected gazes, versions of herself trapped in Marcus's mirrors, each one silently screaming for help that never came. The invitation cards were cream-colored with gold lettering, announcing Sophie Anderson's 8th birthday celebration in elegant script. Marcus had insisted on inviting her entire class, 24 children, plus their parents. It would be, he explained to Claire, an excellent opportunity to observe Sophie's social development in a controlled group setting. I've arranged everything, he told them at breakfast, 3 days before the party. Entertainment, catering, and of course a very special surprise. He made a note in his book while giving Sophie one of his studying looks. Your mother and I have decided that Whiskers can be part of the celebration. Sophie brightened slightly at the mention of her cat. Whiskers was one of the few comforts she had left, a gray tabby who'd been with them since before her father died. Recently, Marcus had restricted the cat to the basement, claiming allergies, but allowing short supervised visits that he meticulously documented. The day of the party arrived bright and cold. The house had been transformed with decorations that seemed more suited to a scientific conference than a child's birthday, everything in precise geometric patterns. Mirrors strategically placed to maximize spatial awareness during social interactions. as Marcus explained to the first arriving parents. Sophie stood greeting guests in the dress Marcus had selected, navy blue with white collar, appropriate for behavioral observation documentation. She watched him circulate among the parents, charming them with his credentials and casual mentions of his research at Harvard. Now, Marcus announced once all the guests had arrived, "I've prepared a special activity. Children, please gather in the living room." He stood before the assembled group, notebook in hand. "Today, we're going to play a very special game I've developed. It's called Finding Whiskers." He smiled at Sophie. "Your cat is hidden somewhere in the house. The first child to find him wins a special prize." Sophie's stomach dropped. She hadn't seen Whiskers all morning. The children scattered, excited by the prospect of a hunt. Sophie ran from room to room, calling for her cat with increasing desperation. She checked all of Whiskers' favorite spots: under beds, behind curtains, in sunny windowsills. Nothing. Note subject's elevated stress response. She heard Marcus murmur into his recorder as she passed him. Initiation of separation anxiety protocol successful. Hours passed. The party continued with cake and games, but Sophie barely noticed. Her eyes kept darting to corners and shadows, searching for any sign of gray fur. Parents began arriving for pickup, commenting on what a lovely party it had been. "Still no sign of Whiskers?" Claire asked that evening, helping clean up. "He's probably just spooked from all the noise. He'll come out when he's hungry." But Whiskers didn't come out that night, or the next day, or the day after. Sophie barely slept, lying awake listening for familiar paw steps or meowing. During the day, she searched every inch of the house while Marcus watched, taking notes on her progressive emotional deterioration. Fascinating how attachment objects influence childhood development. He commented to Claire over dinner on the third night. The loss of a pet can trigger remarkable psychological responses. Then, on the fourth morning, Sophie came downstairs to find Whiskers sitting in the kitchen, calmly eating from his bowl as if he'd never been gone. "Remarkable timing," Marcus noted in his book. Subject displays intense emotional release upon reunion with stimulus object. Duration of separation anxiety response: approximately 72 hours. Excellent data for the attachment study. That night, Sophie held Whiskers close in her bed, feeling his purr against her chest. Through her heating vent, she could hear Marcus in his study above. Phase 1 of separation anxiety study complete. Subject displayed all classic symptoms: sleep disruption, appetite decrease, emotional instability. Recommend proceeding to Phase 2 with extended duration. Sophie buried her face in Whiskers' fur, trying not to think about where he'd been for those 3 days, or why his fur smelled faintly of the same antiseptic that Marcus used in his office. In the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of Marcus passing by her door, silver notebook in hand, smiling that cold, clinical smile that never reached his eyes. Ms. Henderson first noticed the changes in Sophie during morning circle time. The once eager participant now sat silently, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the classroom's colorful carpet. When asked to share her weekend activities, Sophie spoke in whispers, carefully measuring each word as if they were being recorded. "I just stayed home. Marcus, my stepdad. He says it's better to observe than participate." It was during the parent-teacher conference in early March that Ms. Henderson met Marcus Sullivan for the first time. He arrived precisely 12 minutes early, leather briefcase in hand, Claire rushing to keep up with his long strides. "I've taken a special interest in Sophie's academic environment," he explained, settling into the small chair with casual authority. "In fact, I'm conducting a fascinating study on childhood social adaptation in educational settings." His pen moved constantly across his notebook as he spoke. "I'd like to volunteer for some school events. For research purposes, of course." That's how Marcus began appearing at school functions. First, it was the spring concert, where he sat in the back row with his silver recorder, documenting what he called group performance anxiety responses. Then he volunteered to chaperone field trips, always with his notebook, always watching. The spring play was his idea, Little Red Riding Hood, but with what he called therapeutic modifications. I've adjusted the script to explore childhood fear responses, he explained to the principal. Perfectly safe, of course. The data will be invaluable for my research. Sophie was cast as Little Red Marcus had insisted, citing the unique opportunity for controlled fear exposure in a public setting. During rehearsals, he sat in the auditorium, making notes on every hesitation, every trembling word. The night of the performance arrived. Parents filled the elementary school auditorium, smartphones ready to record their children's moments on stage. Marcus set up his own equipment, professional-grade cameras at multiple angles, hidden microphones to capture every sound. Sophie stood in the wings, wearing the red cape Marcus had specially designed. It felt too heavy, lined with something that made it hang like a weight on her shoulders. "Remember," Marcus whispered, adjusting one of his microphones on her collar, "this is all for science. Every reaction, every response, it's data." The play began. Sophie walked onto the stage, the heavy cape making each step feel like wading through water. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, but she could feel Marcus watching, recording, documenting. Then came the wolf scene. Marcus had rewritten it, making it darker, more psychologically intense. The student playing the wolf wore a mask he designed, far more realistic and frightening than typical school play props. "Little girl," the wolf growled, using words Marcus had carefully crafted. "Don't you know what happens to children who wander alone? Don't you know what darkness waits in these woods?" Sophie felt her chest tighten. The cape seemed to grow heavier, the stage lights brighter. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear her lines. From the darkness of the auditorium came the soft whir of Marcus's cameras, recording every moment of her rising panic. "Note the time," she heard his voice from somewhere in the darkness. "Subject displaying acute stress response. Excellent data for the fear study." The room began to spin. Sophie tried to remember her lines, but the words stuck in her throat. The wolf's mask seemed to grow larger, more menacing. The cape pressed down like hands on her shoulders. She ran. Off the stage, through the wings, down the hallway, the heavy cape trailing behind her. She could hear commotion in the auditorium, worried voices, footsteps following. "Don't stop the cameras." Marcus's voice carried down the hallway. "This is invaluable observational data." They found her in the girls' bathroom, huddled in a corner, shaking. Claire tried to comfort her while Marcus stood in the doorway, speaking softly into his recorder. Subject demonstrates classic panic response in public setting. Note correlation between performance pressure and anxiety threshold. Recommend increasing exposure parameters in next phase. The next day, Marcus had a long meeting with the principal. Afterward, he was given permission to install cameras in Sophie's classroom. For a special educational study, he explained to concerned parents. Purely observational. Sophie learned to be still in class, to keep her face neutral, knowing that every expression, every movement, was being captured, analyzed, documented in Marcus's ever-growing collection of research notes. Above her desk, a small red light blinked steadily, recording everything for science. Ms. Roberts, the school counselor, had a room filled with gentle colors and soft toys, everything designed to make children feel safe and heard. Sophie sat in an oversized beanbag chair, staring at the sand tray on the low table before her. "You wanted to talk to me about something?" Ms. Roberts asked, her voice warm and encouraging. She'd noticed Sophie lingering by her office during lunch breaks, watching the door with anxious eyes. Sophie picked up a small figure from the sand tray, a girl in a red dress, and buried it up to its neck in sand. "It's about Marcus," she whispered, not looking up. "My stepdad, Dr. Sullivan?" Ms. Roberts leaned forward slightly. "He's been doing wonderful work with our school. The principal speaks very highly of his research. Sophie's fingers trembled as they pressed the figure deeper into the sand. "He does things. Experiments. Experiments?" Ms. Roberts kept her voice gentle, professional. "What kind of experiments, Sophie?" The words came out in a rush. The closet, the mirrors, Whisker's disappearance, the tea, the cameras. As she spoke, Sophie kept burying and unburying the little figure, unable to look at Ms. Roberts's face. He says it's all for science, Sophie finished, her voice barely audible. But it feels wrong. Ms. Roberts was quiet for a long moment, studying her notes. These are very serious things you're saying, Sophie. I'll need to discuss this with Dr. Sullivan, of course. No. Sophie's head snapped up, panic clear in her eyes. Please, you can't tell him I've already messaged him, Ms. Roberts said, checking her phone. In fact, he's on his way now. We need to handle this properly. 20 minutes later, Marcus sat in Ms. Roberts's office, his presence somehow making the cozy space feel cold and clinical. He'd brought his notebook, of course, and a thick file labeled, Subject S. Behavioral Patterns. I'm so glad you called me, he said, smiling at Ms. Roberts. Sophie's case is particularly fascinating from a research perspective. What you're interpreting as concerning behavior is actually part of a groundbreaking study on childhood trauma responses. He opened the file, spreading out papers covered in dense academic text and graphs. You see, children who've experienced loss often develop complex fantasy structures. The closet sessions, controlled exposure therapy for anxiety, the mirrors, standard self-awareness exercises. Everything is meticulously documented and approved by my research board. Sophie sat frozen in the beanbag chair as Marcus explained away each of her fears with scientific terminology and professional authority. She watched Ms. Roberts's face change from concern to embarrassment as Marcus spoke. In fact, he continued, this very incident is valuable data for my study on attention-seeking behavior in grief-affected children. Sophie is helping us understand how trauma manifests in educational settings. I had no idea, Ms. Roberts said, looking chagrined. Your work sounds fascinating, Dr. Sullivan. I'm so sorry for any implication. Not at all, Marcus smiled, making a note in his book. These misunderstandings provide excellent research opportunities. Now, Sophie, shall we discuss why you felt the need to create these elaborate narratives? The ride home was silent. In his study that evening, Sophie heard Marcus on the phone with Claire. Yes, completely normal behavior for her age. No, the school counselor understands now. Actually, this incident provides excellent data for my research. I recommend increasing our private therapy sessions to better document her responses. Later, lying in bed, Sophie heard him in his study above her room, dictating into his recorder. Subject demonstrates unexpected initiative in seeking external intervention. Note possible correlation with recent increase in stimulus intensity. Recommend implementing heightened isolation protocols and accelerating phase 3 of the study. The next day, a new camera appeared in her bedroom, its red light blinking steadily through the night. On her desk, Marcus had left a note in his precise handwriting. For science. 2 months had passed since the counselor incident when Katie appeared at their front door one Saturday morning. Sophie was arranging her breakfast plate according to Marcus's proper nutritional documentation standard when she heard the doorbell. Sophie. Katie's voice carried through the foyer. Mom's letting me bring back your science book. I can stay for a little while. Sophie's heart leaped and plummeted simultaneously. Through the dining room mirror, one of many Marcus had installed, she saw him emerge from his study, notebook already in hand. Interesting timing, he murmured, clicking his pen. Unexpected social variable introduction during controlled isolation period. Katie bounded into the kitchen, then stopped abruptly. She'd last visited before the tea incident, before Marcus had transformed their home into what he called his research environment. Her eyes darted around the changed space, the cameras mounted in corners, the mirrors on every wall, the detailed behavior charts Marcus kept posted by the refrigerator. Wow, Katie whispered. Your house looks different. We've adapted the environment for optimal research conditions, Marcus explained, moving to the kitchen counter where the familiar blue teapot sat. Perfect timing, actually. I've been documenting longitudinal effects of social reintegration after controlled isolation. Would you girls like some tea? Sophie watched in horror as Marcus reached for the teapot, the same one he'd used months ago. Her eyes fixed on his methodical movements, measuring the water, adding his special blend, checking the temperature with scientific precision. Subject 1 displays acute stress response to stimulus reintroduction. He dictated softly into his recorder. Note: dilated pupils, increased respiratory rate. Katie, Sophie managed to whisper, maybe you should. But Katie was already watching Marcus prepare the tea with curious eyes. Is it the same kind as last time? Mom said I got really sick. But I don't really remember. An improved formula, Marcus smiled, his pen moving across paper. The previous batch provided excellent baseline data, but this version should produce more quantifiable results. Sophie saw it all happening again. The careful pouring, the scientific observation, Katie's trusting acceptance. Through the kitchen mirrors, she caught fragments of Marcus's expression. Clinical interest, detached fascination, the cold excitement of a researcher on the verge of breakthrough. Stop! The word burst from Sophie before she could stop it. Katie, don't drink it. Please. Marcus's pen paused mid-stroke. Interesting intervention, he murmured. Subject demonstrates protective response despite conditioning. Katie looked between them, confusion clouding her face. Sophie? What's wrong? Sophie's eyes darted to the cameras, the mirrors, Marcus's ever-present notebook. You got sick last time. Really sick. And he watched, took notes. For his research. Now, Sophie, Marcus's voice took on the smooth, professional tone he used with adults. You're misinterpreting standard research protocols. Katie's previous reaction was an unfortunate incident of food poisoning, as we explained to her parents. But Katie was already backing away from the teacup, looking around the kitchen with new eyes. This is weird, she said quietly. Really weird. I should go. Fascinating, Marcus noted, speaking into his recorder. Secondary subject displays acute awareness response. Primary subject's intervention creates unexpected variable in social reintegration study. After Katie fled, Sophie knew she had to act. She'd seen Marcus preparing another batch of tea, heard him talking about expanding the study group. That night, she crept to the phone while he was in his study, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Emergency services, a tired voice answered. Please, Sophie whispered, my stepdad. He's doing experiments. He makes people drink things. He locks me in dark places. Is this a prank call? The dispatcher cut in. Little girl, we've talked about this before. Making false reports is very serious. But I'm not lying. Last time you didn't believe me about the tea, and then Katie got sick, and now he's going to do it again. I'm reporting this number for misuse of emergency services, the dispatcher said firmly. If you need attention, there are better ways to get it. Sophie hung up, tears streaming down her face. Through the hallway mirror, she saw Marcus standing behind her, notebook in hand. Failed intervention attempt noted. He dictated calmly. Subject displays increasing resistance to research protocols. Recommend immediate implementation of Phase 4. Spring cleaning, Marcus's idea, of course. Every movement had to be documented. Every discarded item photographed and logged. Sophie stood in his office doorway, dust cloth in hand, watching him adjust his cameras before leaving for a conference presentation. Document everything you clean, he instructed, checking his equipment one final time. The relationship between environmental organization and psychological state is a crucial aspect of my research. He paused at the door. And Sophie, my office is now part of your cleaning duties. For science, it was the first time she'd been allowed in his office alone. Usually, it was only 4 sessions. The closet, the mirrors, the endless documentation of her fears. Now, armed with her dust cloth, Sophie began exploring the space that had haunted her nightmares. The office looked different in daylight. Files lined the walls, each labeled with children's initials and dates. Her own file cabinet was largest, Subject S primary study. Behind his desk sat the laptop, the one she'd seen him typing in during every session, recording every tear, every tremor, every plea. Sophie hadn't planned to look, but as she dusted his desk, the laptop screen flickered to life, asking for a password. Her fingers moved without conscious thought, typing what she'd seen him enter countless times while documenting her progress. Whisper Study 2025. The screen opened to a folder labeled Project Whisper. Inside, hundreds of video files filled the screen. Sophie clicked one at random. It was her, in the closet, calling out in darkness. Marcus's voice came through clearly. Subject displays increasing stress response at 14 minutes. Note correlation between darkness duration and anxiety levels. Another file. Sophie surrounded by mirrors, crying as her reflections seemed to mock her. Dissociative response achieved at 22 minutes. Excellent data for identity dissolution study. File after file documented every session, every therapy, every moment of fear and confusion. But it was the written documents that made her blood run cold. Project Whisper. A comprehensive study of induced trauma in childhood development methodology. Systematic exposure to controlled fear stimuli. Subject selection. Primary subject, S. Chosen for optimal vulnerability factors. Recent paternal loss. Isolated mother. High emotional sensitivity. Goal. Documentation of trauma response development in controlled environmental conditions. Sophie read about how he'd selected her mother, chosen their family specifically for his research. How every moment since he'd entered their lives had been calculated, measured, documented. The tea incidents, the closet sessions, Whisker's disappearance. All carefully planned experiments in what he called fear response cultivation. Through the office window, she saw his Tesla pulling into the driveway. He'd forgotten something, coming back early. In the seconds before panic set in, Sophie's eyes fell on the laptop's USB port. The memory stick was small, red, a Christmas gift from her father years ago. She'd kept it on her keychain, and used until now. With shaking hands, she plugged it in, dragging the most damning files across. Videos, documents, research notes, footsteps on the stairs. Sophie yanked the memory stick free, shoving it into her pocket as she grabbed her dust cloth. When Marcus opened the door, she was dusting his bookshelf, careful to keep her back to him so he couldn't see her face. Interesting, he murmured, reaching for his notebook. Subject demonstrates unusual tension response during assigned task. Note possible correlation with unauthorized office access. That night, listening to his footsteps above her room, Sophie made her decision. Her hand clutched the memory stick under her pillow as she reached for the phone, dialing 9111 final time. She knew they wouldn't believe her about the experiments. They never had before. But this time she had a different story to tell. "Please," she whispered into the phone, "help. My stepfather wants to do bad things to me." Through her heating vent, she heard Marcus in his study, beginning final phase of Project Whisper. Subject's resistance indicates readiness for culmination of trauma response study. Sophie slipped the memory stick behind her loose baseboard, where she'd seen Marcus hide things before. Then she waited, listening to the distant sound of sirens growing closer, knowing that this time, she had proof. This time, someone would have to believe her. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Red and blue lights flooded Marlborough Street as multiple units surrounded the brownstone. Officer Sarah Chun led the team, having dealt with enough false allegations to be cautious, but something in the child's voice had triggered her instincts. Inside, they found Marcus Sullivan in his study, supremely calm, already reaching for his credentials. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he began, his professional smile firmly in place. "I'm a child psychiatrist conducting authorized research," but Sophie was already moving. While the officers secured the house, she darted to her room, prying loose the baseboard with trembling fingers. The red memory stick felt impossibly small in her hand as she ran back to Officer Chun. "Please," she whispered, pressing it into the officer's palm. "Look." What followed was a systematic dismantling of Marcus Sullivan's carefully constructed facade. The laptop, secured as evidence, revealed the true nature of Project Whisper. Videos, documents, research notes, all meticulously cataloging his systematic traumatization of a 7-year-old girl under the guise of scientific research. Subject demonstrates heightened fear response to controlled stimuli. His clinical voice echoed through the precinct as detectives reviewed the footage. Recommend increasing isolation parameters. The investigation uncovered more than just Sophie's torment. Hidden in encrypted files were proposals for expanding Project Whisper, plans to recruit more subjects from vulnerable families. Marcus had been building toward a larger study, using Sophie as his proof of concept. Claire collapsed when they showed her the evidence, her world shattering as she realized how completely she'd been manipulated. He said it was therapy, she kept repeating, holding Sophie close. He said he was helping us heal. Marcus remained eerily composed during his arrest, speaking into an imaginary recorder. Note: interesting development in subject-response paradigm. Law enforcement intervention provides unexpected variable in trauma study. 6 months later, Sophie sat in a real therapist's office, warm, safe, without cameras or mirrors. Dr. Sarah Martinez specialized in helping children recover from trauma, her methods gentle and transparent. "You know what the bravest thing is, Sophie?" Dr. Martinez asked during one session. "You recognized something was wrong and you kept trying to tell people until someone listened. That's real courage." The preliminary hearing revealed the full scope of Marcus's plans. His research, deemed ethically abhorrent by the medical board, had been building toward a controversial theory about trauma's role in childhood development. Sophie had been his test case, her suffering meticulously documented to support his hypothesis. In a way, Detective Chun told Claire, her last call saved more than just herself. He had files on other potential subjects, other vulnerable families he was planning to infiltrate. 1 year later, Sophie stood before a different kind of audience: the Boston Police Department's annual awards ceremony. She received a special commendation for courage, her story helping to establish new protocols for handling children's emergency calls. "Sometimes," she said in her small but steady voice, "the scariest monsters are the ones who take notes." In her new room, without cameras or mirrors, Sophie kept a small box. Inside was the red memory stick that had finally given her a voice that adults would hear. Next to it lay a newspaper clipping about Marcus's sentencing and license revocation. And beneath both, a simple note from Detective Chun: "Never stop telling the truth. Someone will always listen eventually." At night, when the shadows grew long, Sophie no longer heard the scratch of Marcus's pen or the whir of hidden cameras. Instead, she heard the gentle purr of whiskers beside her, her mother's footsteps in the hallway bringing comfort instead of anxiety, and the blessed silence of a home where no one was taking notes on her fears. She was no longer Subject S. She was just Sophie, learning to be a child again, one unmarked day at a time.